He had expected to find a corpse, or, failing that, a consumptive bride tucked away in a drafty room, coughing her life into a silk handkerchief, a quiet and convenient demise. He had married her for that purpose, a final, grim transaction to settle a debt and acquire a duchess who would not trouble him with demands for court, for children, for affection. He had left her in the rain at the gates of his crumbling ancestral home, a place as hollowed out and forgotten as his own heart, and had not looked back. He had expected a black-edged letter within a year. He did not expect, upon his return, to find the gates repaired, the drive clear, and smoke pluming from the kitchens. He did not expect to find his tomb breathing. He did not expect to find her, not dying, but magnificent, ink-stained and furious, ruling a kingdom she had built from the ashes he had left her. He did not expect that in defending the honor of the duchess he barely knew, he would be defending the only home he had ever had, and that she, mistaken for a common maid, would be listening to every word. The solicitor's office smelled of dust and sealed away lives. Alara Vance felt the scent coat the back of her throat, a dry, papery taste that mingled with the perpetual dampness clinging to her lungs. She held a handkerchief to her mouth, not out of delicacy, but to stifle the cough that rattled in her chest, a traitorous little drumbeat announcing her frailty to the room. Beside her, her uncle, Mr. Sterling, sweated in his wool coat, his face a mask of pinched desperation. He was the one who had brought her here, to this final, humiliating auction. Across the polished mahogany desk sat the buyer, Alastair Finch, the Duke of Blackwood. He was not what she had imagined. The name conjured images of bloated, gouty aristocrats, but the man before her was lean and hard, cut from granite and winter shadow. His dark hair was clipped short, severe as a soldier's, and his eyes, a startling, pale gray, were devoid of any discernible emotion. They rested on her for a moment, a dispassionate assessment of livestock, before flicking away to the paperwork spread before him. He looked, she thought with a flicker of bitter humor, profoundly bored. The debts of the late Baron Vance, the solicitor, a man whose face seemed made of wrinkled parchment, intoned, amount to £63,000, owed to the Blackwood estate. Her uncle flinched as if struck. It was a sum so vast, so astronomical, it ceased to have meaning. It was a mountain that had crushed her family, leaving her stranded on its barren slopes. A debt my client is prepared to forgive, the solicitor continued, his gaze sliding toward Alara, in exchange for the hand of Miss Alara Vance in marriage. The words hung in the air, stripped of all romance, of all pretense. It was not a proposal. It was a foreclosure. She was the final asset to be liquidated. The Duke had not spoken a word. His attention was fixed on a point just beyond the window, as if he were observing military maneuvers on the gray London rooftops. He was a man accustomed to command, to making decisions of war and state. This, Alara understood with piercing clarity, was a piece of tedious domestic administration. He was acquiring a wife the way he might acquire a parcel of land, for strategic purposes, its intrinsic qualities being of little to no interest. She is of a delicate constitution, your grace, her uncle stammered, a pathetic attempt at either honesty or a warning. For the first time, the Duke's gaze returned to her. It was heavy, impersonal. He noted the pallor of her skin, the slight tremor in her hands, the handkerchief clutched in her white-knuckled grip. His expression did not soften. If anything, a flicker of something akin to satisfaction crossed his features. A delicate wife was a quiet wife. A sickly wife was a temporary one. "I'm aware," was all he said. His voice was low and resonant, a sound like stones grinding together deep underground. It held the chill of the office, the finality of a closing tomb. Alara met his gaze. She did not look away. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cower. In her worn gray dress, with the cough a living thing in her chest, she was powerless, a pawn in a game played by men. But in her eyes, a lucid, defiant green, she held the last vestiges of her sovereignty. She would not weep. She would not plead. She would be sold, but she would not be broken. He saw it. For a bare second, his impassive mask wavered. A flicker of surprise, perhaps, or irritation. He had expected tears or swooning, the predictable hysterics of a ruined woman. He had not expected this silent, searing defiance. He gave a curt nod to the solicitor. The arrangements are satisfactory. Have the papers drawn up. He rose from his chair, his tall frame dominating the small room, casting them all in his shadow. He did not offer her his hand. He did not offer her a single word of comfort or welcome. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of dismissal, and turned to leave. "Your Grace," Ilara's voice, though quiet, cut through the musty air. It was rough from her cough, but it was steady. He paused, his hand on the doorknob, his back to her. "You are purchasing a duchess," she said, each word precise, cold. "I trust the position comes with a residence." The silence that followed was absolute. Her uncle looked horrified, as if she had just slapped the man. The solicitor's pen froze above the inkwell. The Duke turned his head slightly, his profile stark against the gray light of the window. A muscle worked in his jaw. It was not the question of supplicant. It was a demand for the terms of her surrender. "You will have Blackwood Manor," he said, his voice clipped. "In the north." He did not need to say more. Everyone knew of Blackwood Manor, the Duke's forgotten seat, a Gothic monstrosity in a desolate corner of the country, abandoned for generations, rumored to be sinking back into the marshlands from which it had sprung. It was not a home. It was an exile. "I see," she said, her voice betraying nothing. "Thank you for the clarification." He left without another word. The closing of the door was a soft, final thud, a period at the end of a sentence she had not written. Her uncle finally exhaled, a long, shaky sound. "Ilara, my dear girl, you should not have—" "Should not have what, uncle?" she asked, her gaze still fixed on the door. "Ask the price of my own cage." She finally allowed the cough to come, a dry, racking sound that shook her slender frame. As she pressed the handkerchief to her lips, she saw a tiny, bright speck of red against the white linen. She folded it away, hiding the evidence. He had bought himself a dying bride. She had just secured a place to do it. The transaction was complete. The journey north was a study in gray misery. For 3 days, the carriage rattled over rutted roads, its interior a cramped, musty box that smelled of damp wool and old leather. Ilara sat opposite the Duke, a chasm of silence stretching between them. Rain sluiced down the windows, blurring the landscape into a watercolor wash of brown and green. The world outside was dissolving, and she felt as if she were dissolving with it. Alistair did not speak to her. He spent the long hours staring out the window, his expression grim and distant. His thoughts were not here, in this carriage with his inconvenient new wife. They were in London, with its political machinations and whispered treacheries. They were on the continent, in the smoke-choked fields where he had lost his youth and his capacity for feeling. This journey was an interruption, a distasteful duty to be endured before he could return to the things that mattered. He had seen the flicker of defiance in her eyes at the solicitor's office, and it had annoyed him. It was a complication. He had chosen her for her weakness, her family's desperation, her documented ill health. He had engineered this arrangement to be clean, simple. He would install her in the north, far from society, far from him. He would continue his life, unburdened. Her role was to exist quietly, and then, even more quietly, to cease existing. Her flash of spirit suggested she might not be so accommodating. He glanced at her now. She was huddled in the corner, a gray blanket pulled up to her chin, her face pale and drawn in the gloom. Her eyes were closed, but he knew she was not sleeping. The tension in her slight frame was a palpable thing. She looked fragile, breakable. Good. His annoyance subsided, replaced by the familiar, hollow ache of duty done. He had saved her from debtor's prison, at least. He had given her a name and a roof, however rotten. His conscience, what little remained of it, was clear. Ilara, behind her closed eyelids, was acutely aware of his gaze. It felt like a physical weight, cold and assessing. She kept her breathing even, feigning sleep, conserving what little energy she had. The constant jostling of the carriage had settled deep in her bones, an ache that harmonized with a deeper ache in her lungs. Each breath was a conscious effort, a small victory against the damp chill that seemed to seep through the very walls of the coach. She was not afraid of him. She had exhausted her capacity for fear long ago, watching her father gamble away their fortune, watching her mother fade from grief, watching her own future shrink to this single, narrow point. What she felt instead was a profound, weary cynicism. This man, this Duke, was just another force of nature, like a storm or a plague, to be weathered and survived. He was not her husband. He was her jailer. On the evening of the third day, the carriage slowed, its wheels sucking at thick mud. Through the rain-streaked glass, Elara saw it. Blackwood Manor rose from the mist like a jagged black tooth, a skeletal silhouette against a bruised purple sky. Gnarled, leafless trees clawed at its stone walls, and what must have once been great lawns were now a wild, tangled morass of weeds and brackish pools of water. No lights shone from its dozens of vacant, staring windows. It was not a house. It was a carcass. The carriage lurched to a halt before a set of immense, wrought-iron gates, half swallowed by ivy. A figure emerged from the deepening twilight, a man holding a lantern that cast a weak, flickering glow. He fumbled with a great, rusted lock. Alistair opened the carriage door himself, letting in a gust of wind and rain that smelled of decay and wet earth. He stepped out, his boots sinking into the mud. He did not turn to offer her a hand. Elara gathered her blanket and her resolve. She climbed down from the carriage, her thin shoes instantly soaked, the cold mud seeping through the worn leather. The rain plastered her hair to her scalp and trickled down her neck. She stood beside him, a small, shivering figure in the shadow of his immense, decaying inheritance. "Welcome to Blackwood, Your Grace," he said, the words a mockery. His gaze swept over the ruin before them, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not sadness, not regret, something colder, a kind of bitter recognition, as if he were looking at his own reflection. The gates groaned open. The carriage lurched forward, on the final approach to the house. Alistair did not move to get back in. "I will not be staying," he announced to the rain-swept air. A fresh coach, its horses already stamping impatiently, stood waiting in a small, less overgrown clearing to the side. His valet was already strapping his luggage to its roof. Elara simply stared at him, the rain running down her face like tears she refused to shed. "This is your domain now," he said, finally turning to look at her. His face was a mask of indifference, but his eyes were hard. "The staff are adequate. The house accounts are at your disposal, such as they are. I require nothing from you but discretion." Discretion. The word was a euphemism, elegant and cruel. "Be quietly. Do not bother me. Do not exist in any way that requires my attention." He did not wait for a reply. He gave her a final, dismissive nod, the same one he had given her in the solicitor's office, a gesture that sealed her fate. He turned and walked toward the waiting coach, his long coat flaring out behind him. He did not look back. He did not hesitate. Elara stood alone in the mud and the driving rain, the cold seeping into her bones, and watched the man who was her husband abandon her to the tomb he had bought for her. The grand front door of Blackwood Manor creaked open, spilling a weak, yellow light into the gloom. A severe, gray-haired woman in a black dress stood silhouetted in the doorway, her expression as welcoming as a headstone. The Duke's carriage disappeared into the night. Elara took a breath, the damp air catching in her throat, and walked toward the house. The woman in the doorway was Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper. Her face was a collection of disapproving lines, and her eyes, small and dark, raked over Elara's drenched form with undisguised contempt. She saw not a duchess, but a mud-stained, half-drowned waif. An inconvenience. "Her Grace," she said, the title dripping with irony. She did not curtsy. "Show me to my room," Elara said, her voice a hoarse whisper. She was too cold, too exhausted for a battle of wills. That would have to wait. Survival came first. The room was a cavern of cold. It was vast, ornate, and utterly, soul-crushingly frigid. A funereal bed with heavy, moth-eaten velvet curtains dominated the space. A film of dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and cold ash from the cavernous, empty fireplace. A persistent draft snaked its way from the ill-fitting window frame, a ghostly finger tracing its way down her spine. Mrs. Gable had a young, terrified-looking maid bring up a hip bath and 2 buckets of lukewarm water. A threadbare towel and a coarse nightgown were laid on the bed. A single, meager log was placed in the fireplace, where it refused to do more than sullenly smolder, producing more smoke than heat. Then she was left alone. For a week, Alara barely left the bed. The chill of the journey and the drenching at the gate had settled deep in her lungs, blooming into a feverish, hacking cough. She swam in and out of consciousness, the line between waking and dreaming blurred. In her lucid moments, she was aware of the vast, oppressive silence of the house, broken only by the rattling of the window and the scuttling of unseen things in the walls. The young maid, whose name was Rose, would bring her thin broth and weak tea. She moved with a skittish fear, her eyes always darting toward the door, as if expecting Mrs. Gable to appear and punish her for some unknown transgression. The housekeeper herself only appeared once a day, standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, her expression confirming her grim expectations. This duchess was exactly as advertised, weak, sick, and soon to be a footnote in the history of the house. Alara felt her will begin to fray. The cold was a constant enemy, a physical presence that leached her strength. The bed was a damp trap, the room a gilded cage. Despair was a heavy blanket, far heavier than the threadbare wool one she clutched to her chin. This was it. This was the end he had planned for her. To fade away in this forgotten corner of the world, a ghost in a house already full of them. She could feel herself sinking, giving in to the seductive pull of oblivion. It would be so easy to just stop. One morning, she woke to the familiar sound of the rattling window, but this time it was accompanied by a new noise, a frantic, desperate scrabbling. She pushed herself up on her elbows, her head swimming. A small bird had found its way into the room, likely through a crack in the window pane, and was now beating itself against the glass, trying to get out. She watched it, her breath catching in her chest. The bird was frantic, its tiny heart surely hammering. It threw itself again and again at the invisible barrier, driven by a primal, desperate instinct for freedom, for the sky it could see but not reach. And in that moment, something shifted inside Alara. A white-hot surge of fury, so potent it burned away the feverish fog. She was that bird. She was beating herself against the walls of this room, of this illness, of this fate that had been chosen for her. But unlike the bird, her barrier was not invisible. She could see it. She could see the damp walls, the disapproving housekeeper, the ghost of a husband who had left her here to die. She threw back the covers. Her legs were weak, trembling as her bare feet touched the freezing floorboards, but she stood. She swayed, gripping the bedpost for support, her vision tunneling. But she did not fall. She walked to the window. Her hands were shaking, but she managed to work the stiff latch. With a groan of protesting wood, the window swung open, letting in a rush of clean, cold, life-giving air. The bird, stunned for a moment, found the opening and was gone, a streak of brown against the gray sky. Alara leaned her forehead against the cold glass of the casement, taking a deep, shuddering breath. The air hurt her lungs, but it was the pain of being alive. She was not going to die. Not here. Not like this. She turned, her eyes scanning the room, no longer seeing a tomb, but a battlefield. She was no longer a dying woman. She was a living one, and she was going to fight. When Rose arrived with her morning broth, she found the Duchess of Blackwood out of bed, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the sullen fireplace. "Your Grace," the girl whispered, startled. Rose, Ilara's voice was raspy, but it held a new, steely edge. I will not be staying in this room. It is a mausoleum. Is there a smaller room, a servant's room perhaps, on the south side of the house? One with a working fireplace. Rose's eyes went wide with fear. But Mrs. Gable said, I do not care what Mrs. Gable said, Ilara interrupted, her voice quiet but absolute. I am the Duchess of Blackwood. This is my house. Find me a better room, and then bring me the household ledgers for the last 5 years. The girl stared, caught between the terror of the housekeeper and the sudden, shocking authority of the Duchess. After a long moment, she gave a tiny, jerky nod and fled. An hour later, Ilara was installed in a small chamber, once a lady's maid's room, near the kitchens. It was cramped and plain, but the window faced south, the fireplace drew properly, and it was blessedly wonderfully dry. A fire crackled, small but defiant, pushing back the damp. And on a small, rickety table beside her sat a towering, dusty stack of leather-bound ledgers. Ilara sat down, pulled a book towards her, and opened it. The war had begun. The ledgers told a story of grotesque neglect and profligate waste. For years, the estate had been run on autopilot by Mrs. Gable and a distant, indifferent steward in a town miles away. They were ordering exorbitant amounts of wine for a cellar no one used, bolts of silk for furniture that was rotting, and paying pensions to servants who had died a decade ago. It was a ship with a phantom crew, bleeding money into the sea. Ilara's fury grew, a clean, cold anger that gave her strength. This was not just mismanagement. This was a slow, deliberate murder of a house. Her house. Her first command, delivered to a thunderstruck Mrs. Gable, was to cease all orders from London. All of them. The wine, the fabrics, the spices for a chef who did not exist. But His Grace's accounts, the housekeeper began, her face mottled with rage. Are now my accounts, Ilara stated, not raising her voice. She sat at her small table, a pen in her hand, an ink smudge already on her cheek. And I will not pay for ghosts to feast in an empty hall. We will live off what this estate provides, or we will not live at all. She began to explore. Not the grand, dead halls of the West Wing. She had those doors locked and barred, conserving heat, containing the decay. Instead, she explored the functional heart of the estate. The kitchens, the pantries, the outbuildings. Most were in disrepair, but the bones were good. In the sprawling, overgrown kitchen gardens, she found Mr. Thorne, the groundsman. He was a gnarled, weathered man with hands like oak roots and a face that seemed to have been carved from the very soil he worked. He watched her approach with wary suspicion, his shovel held like a weapon. He was used to being ignored. This is a disaster, she said, gesturing to the chaos of weeds and thorns. He grunted. Been this way for 20 years, miss. Your Grace. I want a vegetable garden, she told him, her breath pluming in the cold air. Here, potatoes, carrots, onions, things that will grow in this soil, things that will keep through the winter. He stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. That's a year's work for 5 men. Then we had best start today, she replied, picking up a rusted trowel. Show me where the soil is least sour. He did not move for a long moment. He watched her, this pale, slender duchess in a borrowed maid's dress and sturdy boots she'd found in a closet, her face smudged with dirt. He saw the cough that still shook her, but he also saw the iron in her spine. He saw her bend down, her hands ungloved, and pull at a stubborn root. With a sigh that seemed to come from the center of the earth, Mr. Thorne spat on his hands, hefted his shovel, and plunged it into the dirt beside her. He was the first to shift his loyalty. He was not the last. Slowly, painstakingly, Ilara began to reclaim her kingdom. She learned the names of the half-dozen remaining staff, the real ones, not the ghosts on the payroll. She discovered Rose had a talent for herbs and set her to tending a small plot outside the kitchen door. She found that the stable boy, Tom, was a decent carpenter and tasked him with repairing the leaking roof over the laundry. She sold off 3 carriages that were rotting in the coach house. She had Mr. Thorne inventory the useless silver in the sealed-off dining room, and sent it to be melted down. The money went not to fripperies, but to glass for the greenhouse, to a new cast-iron stove for the kitchen, to bags of lime for the garden. The house began to change, or rather a small part of it did. The grand, decaying shell remained, but at its heart, a warm, living space began to grow. The kitchens, once cold and silent, were now constantly filled with the scent of baking bread, of simmering soup, of rosemary and thyme drying from the rafters. The staff, who had shuffled through their days with a kind of grim listlessness, now had purpose. They were no longer caretakers of a tomb, but builders of a fortress. And they answered to her, not to the absent Duke, not to the resentful Mrs. Gable, who now found her authority eroded, her pronouncements ignored. They answered to the quiet, tireless woman with the ink-stained fingers and the persistent cough, the woman who knew their names, who worked alongside them, and who was, with sheer, pragmatic will, pulling Blackwood back from its grave. Alara herself was transformed. The work was hard the days long. She was often exhausted, her cough a constant companion, especially in the damp evenings. But it was the exhaustion of effort, not despair. The paleness of her skin was now offset by a healthy flush from working in the wind. Her hands were calloused, and her nails were permanently rimmed with dirt. She had never felt more alive. She had stopped thinking about the Duke. He was a phantom, a signature on a piece of paper. He had given her this ruin, and she had made it her own. She did not need him. She did not want him. This was her world, built by her own hands. One afternoon in late autumn, nearly a full year after her arrival, she stood on a low hill overlooking the manor. The west wing was still a dark, skeletal ruin, but from the kitchens in the east wing, a plume of wood smoke rose, a cheerful banner of defiance against the gray sky. The kitchen garden was a patchwork of earthy browns and hardy greens, the harvest mostly in. The roof no longer leaked. A sense of fierce, profound satisfaction settled over her. It was not a grand home. It was not a palace fit for a duchess. It was small and functional and warm. It was hers. She did not know that a rider was approaching. A solitary man on a tired horse, making his way slowly up the now passable main drive. A man returning not to a home, but to a grave, seeking only the silence of his own defeat. Alistair was bone-weary. The past year in London had been a brutal political slog, a war of attrition fought in smoke-filled rooms and whispered conspiracies. He had won, but the victory tasted of ash. He felt hollowed out, scoured clean of everything but a profound exhaustion. He had pushed through a critical reform bill, outmaneuvered his rivals, and secured his family's influence for another generation. He had done his duty, and he was empty. He had fled the city without a word to anyone, riding north alone. He craved the silence of Blackwood. He yearned for its familiar, honest decay. In a world of shifting allegiances and false smiles, the rot of his ancestral home was a truth he could rely on. He imagined the quiet, the damp, the pervading sense of an ending. It suited his mood perfectly. He had not thought of his wife in months. If he had, it was a fleeting, abstract thought. He assumed the matter had likely resolved itself. He'd half expected a letter to reach him, informing him of her passing. The lack of one was a minor administrative loose end, one he would deal with upon his arrival. Perhaps she was still there, a pale ghost haunting one of the less drafty rooms. It made no difference. She was part of the decay, a feature of the ruin. The first sign that something was amiss was the gate. It stood straight on its hinges. The thicket of ivy had been cut back, the ironwork scrubbed clean of its worst rust. It swung open smoothly at his touch. It was wrong. He rode up the drive. The deep, muddy ruts that had nearly swallowed his carriage a year ago had been filled with gravel. The grasping, skeletal branches of the trees lining the path had been pruned back, creating a clean, clear avenue. The changes were subtle, practical, but to Alistair, who knew this place as an extension of his own bleak soul, they were as jarring as a trumpet blast in a library. As he rounded the final bend, the house came into view, and he stopped his horse, staring. It was still the same grim, Gothic monster. The west wing was still a dark, shuttered ruin, a monument to entropy. But the east wing was alive. Glass gleamed in the windows of the kitchens and the rooms above them. A cheerful plume of smoke rose from a chimney he had not seen used since he was a boy. The sprawling tangle of weeds before it had been tamed into a disciplined, orderly kitchen garden, now mostly turned over for winter, but showing the clear lines of cultivation. It was as if someone had performed surgery on a corpse, and a single limb had jerked back to life. He felt a surge of something he could not name. It was not pleasure. It was a profound, unsettling sense of dislocation. This was his ruin, his tomb. Who had dared to interfere with it? He dismounted, leaving his horse to graze on a patch of surprisingly green grass. He did not go to the grand, ceremonial front door. He knew it would be locked and barred. He walked around the side of the house, toward the source of the life, the kitchens. The air, which should have smelled of mildew and damp stone, smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat. He pushed open the heavy oak door to the kitchen yard and stepped inside. The change was even more dramatic here. The flagstones were swept clean. Barrels of apples stood sorted against one wall. Herbs hung drying from the eaves. Through a window, he could see a fire blazing in the massive kitchen hearth and figures moving within. He felt like an intruder, a ghost in his own home. He strode toward a door that led into what he remembered was the steward's office, a small, perpetually damp room off the main kitchens. He expected to find it empty, covering cobwebs. He threw the door open without knocking. And there she was. She was not in a sickbed. She was not pale and fading. She was sitting at a large, scarred wooden desk that was piled high with ledgers and papers. Her back was to him, her head bent in concentration. Her hair, a warm brown that seemed to absorb the light from the single lamp, was pinned up in a messy, practical knot, with stray strands escaping to curl the nape of her neck. She wore a simple, dark wool dress, its cuffs protected by ink-stained paper sleeves. She was muttering to herself, tapping a column of figures with the end of a pen. If we can reglaze the south-facing wall of the greenhouse before the first hard frost, we might save the winter greens. That means ordering the panes by Tuesday. Alistair stood in the doorway, utterly motionless. This was not the fragile, dying creature he had abandoned in the rain. This woman was formidable. There was an energy radiating from her, a focused intensity that filled the small room. The air crackled with it. He could see the slight, tense line of her shoulders, the determined set of her head. He had left behind a wilting flower. He had returned to find an oak tree. "You are alive," he said. The words were torn from him, a blunt expression of his shock. They sounded harsh, accusatory, even to his own ears. She went rigid. Her head came up slowly. For a moment, she did not turn. He had the distinct impression she was composing herself, gathering her weapons. Then, she swiveled in her chair to face him. Her face was thinner than he remembered, but it was no longer the sickly pallor of illness. It was the lean, sharp focus of a hawk. Her eyes, those startling green eyes, were just as he recalled, lucid and defiant. But now they held something more. Authority. There were smudges of ink on her cheek and chin, like war paint. She looked at him, taking in his travel-stained clothes, his exhaustion, his shock. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her expression before her features settled into a mask of cool, polite inquiry. "I apologize for the inconvenience, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was calm, measured, with an edge of pure, unadulterated ice. The cynical understatement of it, the sheer audacity, struck him speechless. He had expected hysterics, accusations, tears. He had expected a scene. He had not expected to be greeted with the dry, dismissive wit of a head of state interrupted at her work. He stepped fully into the room, his large frame seeming to shrink the space. He was the Duke. He was the master of this house. But the feeling was gone. He felt its absence like a physical amputation. The power in this room, the true authority, was sitting in that chair, regarding him as if he were a mildly interesting but unwelcome interruption. "What is all this?" he asked, his gesture encompassing the tidy room, the ledgers, the scent of life from the kitchens. "It is called husbandry, your grace," she replied, her voice still level. "I believe it is the practice of managing a household and its resources. You may have read of it. It is what one does when one wishes a thing to survive." The rebuke was as sharp and clean as a shard of glass. He had left her in this house to die. She had chosen to live, and had dragged the house with her. A clatter from the hallway announced the arrival of the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. She appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of shock at seeing him and her usual sour disapproval. "Your Grace," she exclaimed, rushing forward. "We had no word. I would have aired your rooms, Alistair held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes never left Alara's. "Who is in charge here, Mrs. Gable?" The housekeeper froze, her mouth opening and closing. Her gaze flickered nervously from the Duke to the Duchess. For a year, she had been fighting a losing battle against Alara's quiet, implacable competence. The staff now went to the Duchess for everything. The old order was broken. Alara did not speak. She simply sat there, her hands resting on her desk, and waited. Her Grace seized to the daily running of things. Mrs. Gable finally mumbled, the admission costing her dearly. "I see," Alistair said softly. He looked back at Alara, at the ink on her cheek, at the strength in her spine. He had bought a duchess to be an ornament for a tomb. He had returned to find a queen on her throne, and he was the intruder in her court. The days that followed were a tense, silent war. Alistair, accustomed to absolute authority, found himself adrift in a world that no longer answered to him. He retreated to his traditional ducal wing, a suite of rooms in the still-decaying part of the house, which the staff, at Alara's direction, hastily cleaned and aired. They brought him food, they lit his fires, but they did so with a kind of polite distance. Their true allegiance was clear. He would wander the dead halls of his part of the house, the air thick with the smell of dust and regret, and hear, from the other side of the barred connecting doors, the distant sounds of life. The clang of a pot, a burst of laughter from the kitchen, the steady rhythm of a hammer. It was a constant reminder that the heart of the house had migrated, leaving him in the cold, empty shell. He was a ghost in his own home, and she was the source of the haunting. He began to watch her. From the window of his study, he would see her in the gardens, conferring with Mr. Thorne, her head bent, a piece of straw tucked behind her ear. He saw her directing the stable boy in the repair of a fence, her gestures economical and precise. She was not playing at being a chatelaine. She was working. Her hands were in the dirt. Her mind was on the accounts. Her will was the engine that drove this small, miraculous revival. One evening, driven by a restless energy he could not explain, he breached the barrier. He unbarred one of the heavy oak doors that separated his wing from hers and stepped through. He found himself in a hallway that was warmer, cleaner. The air smelled of beeswax and drying herbs. He followed the low murmur of voices to the kitchen. The scene that greeted him was one of domestic industry. Rose was kneading dough on a massive flour table. Tom, the stable boy, was mending a harness by the fire, and Alara was sitting at the end of the table with Mr. Thorne, a large, hand-drawn map of the estate spread between them. She was pointing to a section of marshland. "If we can clear the drainage ditch here before the winter rain set in, we might reclaim another 2 acres for pasture next spring," she was saying. "It's ambitious, but Tom thinks the old sluice gate is salvageable." They were all so engrossed in their work they did not notice him standing in the shadows of the doorway. He listened, fascinated. She spoke of crop rotation, of selling timber from a north wood, of the price of wool. Her knowledge was not academic. It was practical, hard-won. She had learned the language of this land, a language he had never bothered to master. He felt a grudging, unwelcome flicker of respect. He had dismissed her as a fragile liability. He was beginning to realize she was more resourceful, more resilient than any man he had ever commanded in battle. "Your Grace," Mr. Thorne said, finally looking up and seeing him. The easy camaraderie in the room evaporated instantly. A tense silence fell. Rose stopped kneading. Tom looked at the floor. Alara looked up, her expression unreadable. "Is there something you require?" Your Grace? Her tone was perfectly polite, the tone one uses with a landlord or a stranger. I require an accounting, he said, the words coming out harsher than he intended. It was a clumsy attempt to reassert his authority, and he knew at the moment he said it. She raised an eyebrow. Of course. The ledgers are in the study, as always. They're quite clear. You will find we are, for the first time in 30 years, operating at a profit. A small one, but a profit nonetheless. She had turned his demand back on him, making him sound like a petty auditor. He felt his face flush with anger, and with something else. Shame. This is my estate, he said, his voice low. Indeed, she agreed, her gaze unwavering. And I have been keeping it from falling into the sea. You are welcome. She turned back to the map, a clear dismissal. Mr. Thorne shifted uncomfortably. Rose began to knead again, but with a frantic, nervous energy. Alistair stood there for a long moment, the unwanted duke in a kitchen that felt more like a war council. He had come here seeking silence and an ending. He had found a burgeoning kingdom and a queen who had no need of him. He turned and walked back into the darkness of his own wing, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click. The sound of life resumed behind it, leaving him alone with the ghosts. The external threat arrived, as it always did, in a flurry of noise and entitlement. A gleaming black carriage, far too fine for the gravel drive, pulled up before the house, drawn by 4 perfectly matched gray horses. Lady Beatrice Finch, Alistair's cousin and a doyen of London society, had arrived. Alistair heard the commotion from his study and swore under his breath. Beatrice was everything he had fled London to escape. Shallow, manipulative, and obsessed with the intricate power games of the aristocracy. Her presence here was a violation, an intrusion of a world he no longer wished to belong to. He went to meet her, his face a thunderous mask. She swept into the main hall, which had been hastily cleaned but still bore the air of a grand museum after hours, her silks rustling, an overpowering scent of French perfume preceding her. "Alistair, darling," she trilled, offering him a powdered cheek to kiss. "I was simply perishing with worry. Not a word for months. We all assumed you'd finally succumb to the gothic gloom of this dreadful place." Her eyes darted around, taking in the faded tapestries and dusty chandeliers with a moue of distaste. "And you have your little bride tucked away here as well, I hear. The sick one. Is she still with us?" The casual cruelty of it grated on Alistair's nerves. "She's, well, Beatrice, and she is the Duchess of Blackwood." Of course, she said dismissively. "Well, I shall be staying for a few days. My maids are simply prostrate from the journey. You must have them see to my things. This place is positively medieval. Does it even have a functioning staff?" It was at that moment that Alara appeared. She was not dressed for receiving guests. She had been in the greenhouse, trying to secure a pane of glass that had been loosened by the wind, and she had come in through the kitchens to fetch a tool. She wore her usual practical wool dress, with an old apron tied over it, smudged with dirt. Her hair was coming loose from its pins, and there was a streak of grime across her forehead. She carried a small hammer in one hand. She stopped dead at the entrance to the hall, seeing the magnificent, perfumed creature standing beside her husband. Beatrice's eyes fell upon her. She took in the dirty apron, the tool, the general air of a woman interrupted at her labor. Her lip curled in a dismissive sneer. "Ah, a housemaid," she said, her voice carrying across the cavernous space. She did not even bother to look at Alara's face. "Girl, see to my luggage, and tell your mistress, the Duchess, that Lady Beatrice Finch has arrived and is expecting tea in whatever passes for a drawing room in this hovel." The silence in the hall was profound. Alistair felt a surge of white-hot rage, so intense it made him dizzy. He opened his mouth to correct her, to unleash a torrent of fury that would peel the paint from the walls. But Alara, amazingly, did not. She simply stood there, hammer in hand, and looked from Beatrice's contemptuous face to Alistair's thunderous one. A strange, calculating stillness came over her. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture not of servitude, but of something else entirely. Of observation. Then, without a word, she turned and walked back the way she had come, disappearing into the dimmer light of the service corridors. She did not go to fetch tea. She went to the small and used butler's pantry that shared a wall with the main drawing room. There was a listening tube there, a relic from a previous, more paranoid duke, designed for eavesdropping on guests. It was dusty and likely hadn't been used in a century. She put her ear to the cold brass opening. She was not disguised as a maid. She had been mistaken for one, and she was about to hear exactly what her husband truly thought of the arrangement she had built. "Where is that insolent girl going?" Beatrice demanded, tapping her foot. "The staff here are clearly feral. You must let me bring some of my own people up from London to whip them into shape, Alistair. And this house, it's a disgrace. Half of it looks ready to collapse." "The West Wing is closed," Alistair said, his voice dangerously quiet. He led her into the drawing room, a vast, cold chamber that Alara had made no attempt to reclaim. A few pieces of furniture were shrouded in white cloths, like ghosts. "Closed? You've closed half your own house." Beatrice laughed, a brittle, unpleasant sound. "How very eccentric. I heard rumors in town, you know, that you'd married some bankrupt, sickly daughter and locked her away up here to die. That the whole estate was in ruins. It seems the rumors were true." In the pantry, Alara's hand tightened on the cold brass of the listening tube. She had expected this. This was the world's judgment. "The estate," Alistair said, and his voice was different now. It was flat, hard, the voice he used when he was about to pass sentence. "Is solvent. For the first time in my lifetime. The home farm is turning a profit. The tenants' rents are paid, and their roofs are repaired. The staff are loyal and work harder than any 10 of your simpering London footmen." Beatrice stared at him, nonplussed. "What on earth are you talking about? Rents and farms? Who cares about such tedious things? I'm talking about your standing, Alistair. Your reputation. Living like this, it's an embarrassment. And this Duchess of yours. If she's so, well, why is she not here to greet me? Is she simple? Or just plain-faced? You can tell me." There was a long pause. Alara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the moment. He could dismiss her, agree with Beatrice, reinforce the cold transaction of their marriage. He could sacrifice her to save his own pride. When he spoke, his voice was laced with a contempt so profound it was almost a physical force. "You stand in a room that has been dead for 50 years, Beatrice, and you complain about the dust. You have no idea what you're looking at. You see decay, because it is all you know how to see. You are blind to competence. You are blind to strength. You are blind to the fact that this estate was pulled back from the brink not by me, but by the tireless, pragmatic, and brilliant woman you just mistook for a housemaid." Alara's breath hitched. A tremor went through her. It was not the praise that struck her, but the sheer, unadulterated fury with which he delivered it. He was not defending her honor in the romantic sense. He was defending her work, her achievement. He was defending the kingdom she had built, and he was doing it with a ferocity that stunned her. "You dare to speak of her?" he continued, his voice rising. "You, who have never done a single useful thing in your entire life. A woman whose greatest accomplishment is a well-placed sneer? The Duchess of Blackwood has more intelligence in her little finger than you have in your entire, vapid soul. She has more character in one of her ink-stained smudges than you have in all your silks and powders. You are not fit to sweep the floor she walks on." "Alistair," Beatrice gasped, scandalized. "How dare you? She is a nobody, a convenience you purchased." "She is the Duchess of Blackwood," he snarled, the words like a whiplash. "And this is her house. You're a guest here, and you have just insulted your hostess. You find the accommodations not to your liking? Excellent. Your carriage is waiting. You may leave at first light. Or, if you prefer, you may leave now. I will not have you here. I will not have you breathe the same air she does." A thick, shocked silence followed. Alara could hear Beatrice's sharp, indignant breaths. She could picture the woman's face, a mask of outrage and disbelief. "You have gone mad," Beatrice finally whispered. "This place, she has bewitched you. Fine, I will leave, but the whole of London will hear of this. They will hear that the Duke of Blackwood has buried himself alive with a common, dirty little shrew and lost his senses. Let them, Alistair said, his voice dropping back to a low, dangerous calm. I find I no longer care what London thinks. Now get out of my sight. Alara heard the rustle of silks, a furious sob, and the sound of Beatrice storming from the room. She stayed pressed against the wall in the dark pantry, her body trembling. He had not known she was listening. He had not been performing for her benefit. It was the truth. His truth. He saw what she had done. He saw its value. He saw her. She pulled away from the listening tube, her mind reeling. She had built her fortress to keep the world out, to keep him out. But it seemed, in her absence, he had stormed the walls all on his own and stood guard, turning his weapons on the outside world to protect what was within. To protect her. She felt a crack appear in the armor she had so carefully constructed around her heart. A tiny, terrifying fissure through which a strange and unfamiliar warmth was beginning to seep. The aftermath of Beatrice's departure was a profound and heavy silence. The house seemed to exhale, settling back into its own quiet rhythm. The intrusion was over. Alistair did not seek Alara out. He retreated to his wing, to the familiar company of his own dark thoughts. But something had changed. The battle had been fought and won, not against each other, but together against a common enemy. A fragile truce had been forged in the fire of his anger. Alara spent the rest of the day in a daze. She went through the motions of her work, checking the stores and the larder, consulting with Rose about a poultice for one of the horses, but her mind was elsewhere. It was in the dark drawing room, replaying his words. The Duchess of Blackwood has more intelligence in her little finger than you have in your entire, vapid soul. It was not a declaration of love. It was a statement of fact, of validation, and it was, in its own way, more potent than any pretty poetry. That night, a storm rolled in from the coast, a gale of wind and driving rain that hammered against the old house. The wind howled in the chimneys and rattled the window frames. Alara lay in her small, warm bed, listening to the fury of the weather, and felt a strange sense of peace. The storm was outside. Inside, she was safe. A crash from the floor below jolted her awake. It was a sharp, splintering sound, followed by the tinkle of breaking glass. It came from his wing, from the Duke's study. For a moment, she hesitated. Her first instinct, the instinct of the past year, was that it was not her concern. His wing was his territory, but the sound had been violent. She slipped out of bed, pulling on a heavy robe. She lit a candle, its small flame flickering wildly in the drafts of the hallway, and made her way toward the connecting door. It was still unbarred from when he had come through to the kitchens. She pushed it open and stepped into the cold, dark territory of the Duke. The study door was ajar. A low, guttural moan came from within. Her heart leaped in her throat. She pushed the door open. The room was a wreck. A heavy bookshelf had been overturned, its contents spilled across the floor. The window had been shattered, and the wind and rain were whipping into the room, sending papers flying. And in the center of it all, Alistair was on his knees. He was not injured. He was elsewhere. His eyes were wide, unseeing, fixed on some point in the middle distance. His hands were clamped over his ears, and his body was rigid, trembling. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was raging inside him. The howl of the wind, the percussive crash of thunder, it had transported him. He was no longer in his study in the north of England. He was back on a muddy battlefield in Spain, the air thick with the screams of men and the roar of cannon fire. Alara understood instantly. This was not madness. It was memory, a wound of the mind torn open by the storm. She did not scream. She did not run. Her pragmatism, the quality he had so fiercely defended, took over. She set her candle down on a stable surface away from the drafts. She walked past him, her bare feet crunching on broken glass, and wrestled with the heavy velvet curtains, pulling them shut against the shattered window, muffling the sound of the wind and rain. The room became quieter, darker, the only light the small, steady flame of her candle. She turned back to him. He hadn't moved. He was lost. "Alistair," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm. It cut through the imagined roar of battle. He flinched, his head jerking toward the sound of her voice, but his eyes were still unfocused. She knelt in front of him, heedless of the damp, the cold, the glass on the floor. She did not touch him, not yet. She simply placed herself in his line of sight, a small, solid presence in the chaos of his mind. "You are not there," she said, her voice even and calm. "You are at Blackwood, in your study. It is just a storm. You are safe." He stared at her, his breathing harsh and ragged. A flicker of recognition appeared in his eyes. He was fighting his way back, swimming up from a great and terrible depth. "The rain," he rasped, his voice raw. "The mud." "Yes," she said softly. "It is raining, but there is no cannon fire. There are no soldiers. There is only the wind." "Listen." She fell silent, letting the muffled sound of the storm fill the space between them. It was just wind now, not the scream of incoming shells. Slowly, agonizingly, the rigidity began to leave his body. His hands lowered from his ears. His gaze focused, really focused on her face. He saw her, kneeling before him, her hair loose around her shoulders, her face filled with a calm, steady concern he had never seen before. He saw the broken glass around her, and a flicker of horror crossed his face. "Alara," he whispered, her name a strange and unfamiliar sound on his lips. She reached out then, and her hand was not trembling. She gently took one of his, her fingers wrapping around his cold, clenched fist. Her touch was not romantic. It was grounding, an anchor in the storm. "I am here," she said. "You are here. You are home." He stared at their joined hands, at her small, calloused fingers holding his. He looked up at her face, at the quiet strength in her eyes. She was not afraid of him. She was not repulsed by his weakness. She had walked into the heart of his private hell and had calmly, practically, let him out. The last of the tension drained from him, leaving him utterly spent. He leaned forward, his forehead coming to rest against her shoulder, a gesture of complete and total surrender. He was the haunted Duke, the ruthless commander, the man who felt nothing. And he had just crumbled at the feet of the woman he had sent away to die. She did not push him away. She did not recoil. She simply held his hand, a small, solid point of warmth in the cold and the dark, and let him find his footing on solid ground again. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, both inside and out, a new dynamic began to form. She helped him to his feet. They did not speak. The language of words felt clumsy, inadequate for what had passed between them. He had shown her the raw, broken thing at the center of his soul, and she had not flinched. She had shown him a strength he had never known, a quiet competence that was as formidable as any army. She surveyed the wrecked study. "This can be cleaned in the morning," she said, her tone practical, matter of fact. She was not pitying him. She was assessing a problem and finding a solution. Her pragmatism was a balm, a return to the solid world of cause and effect. "Come," she said, and led him not back to his own cold bed, but through the connecting door and into her wing, into her world. She took him to the kitchen, the heart of the house. The fire in the great hearth had been banked for the night, but it still glowed with deep, red embers. The room was warm and smelled of yeast and clean linen. It was the safest place in the world. She sat him down in a chair by the hearth, one of the sturdy wooden chairs where she and Mr. Thorne had planned their campaigns. Then, in an act of such profound and unexpected domesticity it almost made him laugh, she began to make him a cup of tea. He watched her, this duchess in her worn robe, as she moved with quiet efficiency, filling the kettle, finding the tin of tea leaves, fetching a cup. She was not playing a role. This was who she was. The situational irony was staggering. The Duke of Blackwood, the man who could make or break governments, was being tended to by his wife, a woman he had acquired in a cold transaction, as if he were a sick child. She brought the tea and set it on the table in front of him. She did not fuss. She simply pulled up another chair and sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around her own cup, the firelight flickering on her face. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer a weapon or a void. It was a shared space, filled with unspoken understanding. "It was the war," he said finally, his voice rough. It was not an apology. It was a confession, a piece of information he had never shared with another living soul. Sometimes the sounds. "I know," she said softly, and he knew that she did. Not the specifics, but the reality of a wound that does not bleed. He took a sip of the tea. It was hot, strong, and sweet. It was the most grounding thing he had ever tasted. "The accounts are a mess," he said, changing the subject abruptly, reaching for the familiar territory of duty and problems. "My father, he let everything go. I never paid it any mind. I had other duties, other wars to fight." "The bones of the estate are good," she replied, her tone matching his, practical and direct. "The land is sour in the west pasture, but the drainage is the main issue. The timber in the north wood is mature. If we harvest it selectively, it would pay for the new roof on the main barn and seed for 3 new fields in the spring." He stared at her. She spoke of his land, his inheritance, with an intimacy he had never possessed. She knew its moods, its weaknesses, its hidden strengths. She had learned it, while he had merely owned it. "We," he repeated, the word tasting strange. She met his gaze across the table. "It is a large task. I had assumed you would be returning to London." It was not an accusation, just a statement of fact based on all her prior evidence. "No," he said, the word coming out with a certainty that surprised him. "I'm not returning to London." A flicker of surprise crossed her face. For the first time, her composure seemed to waver. She had built this life for herself, a fortress of solitude. His presence was a complication she had not planned for. The next morning, he found her in the study, her desk already covered in papers. He did not retreat to his own wing. He pulled up a chair. "Show me," he said. "Show me the drainage problem." She hesitated for only a moment. Then she unrolled the large, hand-drawn map. She began to speak, her finger tracing the lines of streams and fields. He listened, truly listened for the first time. He asked questions. He brought his own formidable intelligence, the mind that could dissect a treaty or a battle plan, to bear on the problems of soil and seed. They began to work together. It was a slow, cautious dance of 2 wary sovereigns learning to share territory. They argued over the price of lime and the best way to repair the sluice gate. Their dialogues were sharp, blunt, and focused entirely on the practical. There were no pleasantries, no apologies. But underneath the arguments, a new foundation was being laid. A partnership. One afternoon, they were in the stables, inspecting the beams of the leaking roof. Alara was pointing out a spot where the wood was soft with rot, her hand resting on the beam. Alistair reached up to test it himself, and his hand covered hers. It was not a caress. It was a simple, practical moment of shared assessment. But the contact sent a jolt through both of them. His hand was large, warm, and solid over hers. Her fingers were slender but strong beneath his. For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was a point of contact that was anchoring, real, more real than their marriage vows, more real than the titles they held. It was the touch of 2 people holding up the same roof. He pulled his hand away first, his expression unreadable. She drew hers back as if burned, a faint flush rising on her cheeks. They did not speak of it. They went back to discussing timber. But the moment lingered in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement that the ground beneath their feet had irrevocably shifted. The silence that fell as they walked back to the house was comfortable, easy. A silence between allies, not strangers. The call from the old world arrived on a cold Tuesday in early December. It came in the form of a royal courier, his horse lathered, his uniform spattered with mud. He carried an urgent dispatch, sealed with the king's own signet. Alara saw him from the study window, and her heart, which had been slowly, cautiously unclenching for weeks, seized tight in her chest. She had known this was an interlude, a temporary truce. He was the Duke of Blackwood. His world was one of power and politics, of London and the court. This small, quiet life they had been building was a convalescence for him, not a destination. He took the dispatch from the courier and broke the seal. He read it standing in the hall, his face grim. Alara watched him from the doorway of the study, her own face a careful, blank mask. She had already put her armor back on. It was heavy, but familiar. "There's a crisis in the cabinet," he said, his eyes still on the letter. "A vote of no confidence is being tabled. My presence, my vote, and influence are required." "I see," she said, her voice perfectly level, cool as the winter air. "I will have your things packed. The roads are poor. You should leave within the hour to reach the main post road by nightfall." She was already the chatelaine again, the efficient manager of his household, facilitating his departure from her world. She was making it easy for him, erasing the fragile intimacy they had built. She was retreating behind her walls, preparing for the silence he would leave behind. He looked up from the letter then, and his gaze was sharp, searching. He saw the change in her instantly, the withdrawal, the cold formality. He saw the queen retreating back into the fortress of the survivor. "Alara," he said, his voice quiet. "Your Grace," she corrected him, a subtle, cruel twist of the knife. She would not allow the familiarity now, not when he was leaving. "Rose will draw you a bath. I will ensure there is food for your journey." She turned, ready to issue the orders, to busy herself with the mechanics of his absence. "Stop," he commanded. It was not the command of a duke to a subordinate. It was the plea of a man to his equal. She paused, her back to him. He walked toward her, the dispatch still in his hand. He stopped just behind her. She could feel the heat of his body, the tension radiating from him. She braced herself for the parting words, the polite thanks for her hospitality, the promise to send funds from London. Instead, he walked past her to the fireplace in the hall where a low fire burned. And in a single decisive movement, he tossed the king's dispatch into the flames. Alara spun around, her eyes wide with disbelief. The wax seal melted, the paper curled, blackened, and was consumed by the fire. The summons from the world of power turned to ash. "What have you done?" she whispered, horrified and confused. "That was from the king." "It was a request," he said, turning to face her. The firelight played on the hard planes of his face, and in his eyes she saw a certainty she had never seen there before. Not the certainty of command, but the certainty of conviction. "My duty is no longer to a cabinet of squabbling old men. My duty is not to a king who barely knows my name." He took a step toward her, closing the space between them. "For my entire life, I have served causes. The war, the crown, the good of the realm, they are all abstractions. Ghosts. They hollowed me out, Alara. They left me with nothing." He was standing before her now, so close she could see the flecks of gray in his dark hair, the exhaustion that still clung to him like a shroud, but was now tempered by this new, fierce clarity. "This," he said, his voice dropping, becoming thick with an emotion she could not name. He gestured not at the house, but at her. "This is not an abstraction. The work you have done here, the life you have clawed back from the mud, the warmth in that kitchen, the way you faced down my own demons in the dark, that is real." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, the one that so often bore a smudge of ink. His touch was not grounding this time. It was electric. It sent a tremor through her entire body. "I came back here to find a grave," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And I found a home. You are my home, Alara." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. "You're my home." It was the declaration her soul had been waiting to hear, a truth she had never dared to imagine. It was not about love in the way the poets wrote of it. It was about something deeper, stronger. It was about belonging. The armor she had so carefully rebuilt shattered. The walls of her fortress crumbled to dust. The fierce, pragmatic survivor who had faced down ruin and despair finally surrendered. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped her eye and traced a path through the faint grime on her cheek. He gently wiped it away with his thumb. "I am not leaving," he said. "Not now. Not ever. Unless you send me away." She looked up at him, her green eyes luminous with unshed tears, with a hope so fierce it was terrifying. She had built a kingdom from nothing, but she had always ruled it alone. The thought of sharing the throne, of trusting someone with a fragile, precious thing she had created, was the most frightening prospect of all. She did not answer with words. She leaned forward, closing the final inch between them, and rested her forehead against his chest. She felt his arms come around her, pulling her close, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. He was solid, real, a bulwark against the winter winds. They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the great, drafty hall of the house that was no longer a tomb. Outside, the December wind howled, promising a long, hard winter. But for the first time, neither of them was facing it alone. The Duke and his Duchess, the haunted soldier and the pragmatic survivor, stood as one, a permanent fixture in the heart of their shared kingdom, a house that was, against all odds, fiercely alive and completely whole.